So again, really excited to see all of you here joining us for an exciting event. And it's really, as someone who I wrote a book, it came out last year with Manchester University Press. It's really exciting to be able to share our work with the world. And as art historians, we get to write about fascinating topics, but it's maybe not the thing that might appear on the New York Times bestseller list. It's more niche. And so when we get to share our research with the world, it's just so rewarding. So I wanted to be able to empower other female authors writing about art and fashion and all these fun topics to be able to share their pioneering research with others and to get the word out, because these books don't belong just in the libraries at universities, but they belong in our homes. And it's really wonderful when we get to learn about this fascinating world of art history and the history of fashion together. So I'm really, really, really excited to introduce all of you today to our guest speaker. Elizabeth Block is an art historian. She is the senior editor in publications and the editorial department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And so she's zooming to us today from New York. She holds a PhD from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, CUNY, an MA in American Studies from Columbia University, and a BA in English and Art History from George Washington. So it's really exciting to have you here today, Elizabeth. Are you from the DC area? A lot of us are zooming in today from the DC area.
That's so interesting. No, I'm from Massachusetts.
Oh, okay. Well, we have a
Went
lot
to
of folks from the East Coast and people from the UK as well joining us. So really exciting to have you here today. And yeah, so what we're going to do is you're going to tell us all about your fascinating book, and we'll be sharing gorgeous images. I'm so excited to see your presentation. And then we'll, of course, I'll monitor the chat. So if you all have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, and then we'll kind of go with the flow, but we'll leave the bulk of the discussion for the end of our time together. So I'll pass it over to you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you all. This is such a treat. And what this group is doing for authors and for art historians is really unmatched. So thank you all for coming today. And Lauren's going to do me the favor of sharing my PowerPoint from her end whenever you're ready. Okay, great. And I'm just going to change my setting for one moment. Excellent. Thank you. So this is the cover of Dressing Up, and I'll just hold up a copy that I have at home. So again, it's really such a pleasure. The topic of American women buying French fashion in the 19th century is endlessly fascinating to me. And what I do in Dressing Up is restore the sense of equilibrium between the creators of couture and the patrons of couture in the period, specifically by looking at the women who were spending money on the garments. Now, many of the names of the women are familiar to us today. So we have the Morgans, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, Schermerhorn, Gould, and if anyone's watching the Gilded Age television show on Max, we might have some questions and answers about that I'm happy to engage with too, because that's sort of the circle of the women that we're talking about. So yes, these were wealthy women who were spending family money, but they were doing it with intention and in many cases, a surprising amount of practicality and frugality. Now, for a sense of context, a couture dress in this period, so we're talking about the 1880s, in the late 1880s specifically for this example, one couture dress could cost $1,600, which is the equivalent of $47,000 today, and that's for one dress. Next slide, please. As with many art historical and social history inquiries, this one started with John Singer Sargent's painting Madam X, which I know Lauren told me you're all familiar with. It's right across the way here from me at the Metropolitan Museum in the American Wing. It dates to 1883 to 84. And I was working on an article about women's fashion and hairstyles in portraiture a few years ago, and I sent a draft to a friend from the Graduate Center, the City University of New York, where I went to school. And he said, Liz, I think we need to know more about who made the dress. Now that's the $6 million question. So that launched a long-time research project on my end into the Maison Felix. We believe that the Maison Felix, this was a couture house in Paris, may have designed this slender black dress that was worn by Madame Gautreau, who is the subject of the painting. Now, Madame Gautreau was from a wealthy New Orleans family, and then she married an even wealthier Parisian banker, and then she became a socialite in Paris for many years and was known for her beauty. Now, in the book, working off of this possibility that the Maison Felix may have designed this black dress that was so scandalous in the salon of 1884 because it was so slender and unadorned, and also because one of the jeweled sleeves was originally down on her shoulder, which was incredibly risque, and then Sargent needed to repaint it upward, which was more respectable. At any rate, that all started this long project on the Maison Felix. And in Dressing Up, I include an entire chapter on Felix and its American clients. The House of Couture was in business from 1846 to 1901. That's a very long span. And it was a competitor to the House of Worth, which is one of the designers who I know at least one of you all listening has been to the Sleeping Beauties exhibition at the Met, which just closed a few days ago. There are examples of House of Worth dresses. So usually if people know one of the houses of couture, it's the House of Worth. And Felix was a competitor to the House of Worth. The owner was Emile Martin Poussinot, who was called Felix. And he took this moniker after the original owner of the business, which is very interesting. It was like a branding that he wanted to keep, and then he took the name himself. And the patrons of the house included royalty, so Empress Eugenie, Queen Margherita of Italy, actresses too, so Sarah Bernhardt, Sophie Croizette, Lily Langtry. But it has fallen out of fashion, not out of fashion, it's fallen out of the historical record because we don't have business documentations for this fashion house, unfortunately. And also the garments have survived in lesser quantities than the House of Worth, for example. But the designs are gorgeous. And if we start looking for garments by Felix, which I've done, I've started finding them, and specifically in the Chicago History Museum, in the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland, where I'll be headed in a few weeks to look at some of them, and also in museum collections in France. And I'm still finding more. Next slide, please. This is an extraordinary example. This is an opera gown from about 1887 by Maison Felix. It's in the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising in Los Angeles. It's a wonderful, wonderful collection there. But this opera gown, it's made of cream-colored silk. You can see that the opera gloves go all the way to the upper arms, past the elbows. The bustle protrudes from the lower back and accentuates the backside, which is the style during the second bustle era of 1883 to 89. The bustle wars happened during this period. The first bustle era was earlier in 1869 to 76. So this is the second one, and it is pretty exaggerated back there. The woman would wear a wire bustle underneath her petticoat to add volume and structure under the silk gown. Now, that museum in Los Angeles also has a matching opera gown which was worn by the teenage daughter of the owner of this opera gown. And I just love to envision the two of them entering an opera house and in these matching gorgeous, extremely expensive dresses. It's just very cinematic in my mind. Anyway, the next slide, please. The Maison Felix shop was at 15 Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honoré in Paris, and it was spread out over several floors. It was very finely decorated, and it was meant to resemble a salon in an upper-class home. And these are wonderful. I wish they weren't in black and white, but this was the period. These are photographs that ran in a newspaper in 1894, right after Maison Felix did a renovation of its spaces. So I think that it looks and feels like an upper class home salon. There were ferns. You can see, if you can envision them, the greenery of those, the plants and the ferns. You can see the soft drapery, the soft carpeting. There was plenty of seating and the mirrors, plenty of mirrors. The house also commissioned original paintings by a French woman painter named Louise Abema, and she painted portraits of theater performers, including Sarah Bernhardt, and those were hung on the walls of this fashion salon and near the dressing rooms. So also live models would circulate throughout these rooms, including Felix's wife, whose name I have not detected yet, but I'm working on it. This was very much a women's space, so there likely would have been a waiting room for husbands downstairs. This was a multi-floor building, or more likely the husbands would have stayed at home or would have been at their men's clubs because women went shopping alone and they went shopping in pairs. They did not need to be escorted by a man. And I like to remind everyone of that, and it'll come up again when we look at a couple of paintings together. In dressing up, I look at the reasons why the Maison Felix may have ended so abruptly in 1901 after being in business for so many decades. As I mentioned, they began in 1846. But it appears that Poussineau, the owner, may have overspent on his lavish displays of his dresses at the Universal Exposition in Paris in 1900. He did this enormous display and may well have overspent, and that's what the newspapers speculate on in 1901. And so it abruptly goes out of business. And then we lose the business records, so who knows what happened to those, unfortunately. But in the book, I also tried to restore our collective knowledge about other designers, many of them who are women and who have received little attention in recent years. And to name just a few of those, Jean Hellet, Paquin, Pingat, Rodrigue, and La Ferrier. The next slide, please. This is a dinner dress by Emile Pingat from 1878 in the Chicago History Museum. These dresses, these couture dresses, they're all over the United States in collections. So if you have museums or historical societies in your local area, be sure to ask them what they have for garments, and usually they'll be very pleased to share. This dress was made of silk brocade, lace, silk, satin. It was worn by Abby Louise Spencer Eddy when she traveled to Paris in 1878 from Chicago. And remarkably, she kept a travel log of her shopping trips. And when I think about her log, I just wish all the women would keep a shopping log. It would make the research so much easier. But thank goodness she did. And she wore this dress 6 years after she married Augustus Newland Eddy in Chicago. So the Eddy, EDDY, was a prominent family in Chicago. And then a year after she had the dress commissioned, she posed in the dress for a portrait by George Peter Alexander Healy. So another documentation that we can use when we research these dresses, in addition to newspaper images and lithographs, for example, are also color beautiful oil on canvas portraits. Next slide, please. Now, we can set the scene for shopping in Paris with this painting by Jean Barraud, who was known for painting Paris city life. We see in this painting from about 1900 a bustling Parisian day. It's a shopping day on the Rue de la Paix, which it is still, I was there just a couple of weeks ago, a famous street for buying high-end couture and watches and jewelry. And at the upper left of this image, we can just about make out the O, then the UCET of the House of Doucet. So it would have said Doucet right there. And in the middle of the image, we see a shop girl holding a dress box for her client. The client is entering the carriage. The doors open for her, and the shop girl will hand her the box, and she'll go home with whatever she purchased from Doucet that day. Next slide, please. Barraud painted many of these slides. This one is in front of the Maison Paquin, also about the same time. And in the upper right, we can make out part of the P, A, and just part of the cube, so Paquin. And this is at number 3 on the same street. And what I like to think about, and there's another scholar, Anna Lisk, who says this, and I really like the way she puts it, is that these signs for these couturiers and for business, all businesses really marked the urban landscape with their names. And when we think of the different families and different ethnicities of people who are working in the couture industry, it becomes really interesting when we look at the background for some of these names. So a lot of the names are, as I've found, so Spanish descent, Jewish descent, Russian descent as well. In this painting, we see 2 very well turned out women in summer afternoon dresses and hats, perhaps discussing their shopping excursion that day. Another customer or shop girl, this one's difficult to tell, but she's to the right of the 2 women in the fancy summer afternoon dresses, but she's leaving the shop and she's holding a parasol. And meanwhile, a carriage has arrived to let off another woman who has come to shop, and she's probably coming out alone. I mean, it's difficult to tell, but as I said, women did shop on their own and without a chaperone. Next slide, please. One of the main themes in dressing up is how vast the fashion industry was in Paris. And when we look at the industry as a whole, we see all the components that made it function. The couturiers, the coiffeurs, who were the hairdressers, the seamstresses, the makers of lingerie, perfumers, the accessory makers. Don't forget all those parasols and gloves that were being made and purchased. The milliners who made the bonnets and hats, the trunk suppliers, the shippers for the transnational customers. All of these specialties relied on one another to make the fashion industry a success. And I focus on, in dressing up, I do a little kind of snapshot view of the hairdressers and the perfumers. And in some ways, this is a lead up to the new book, Beyond Vanity. Sometimes these hairdressers and perfumers were the same person or the same firm. So for example, L'Enterique of Paris, we're looking at an image of a hair salon owned by L'Enterique. And these are from this wonderful series of newspaper images in the New York Herald. It was the Paris edition. This is 1893. And it shows L'Enterique's establishment, which had been fully refurbished the year before. So this was a moment of celebration, and it got a bunch of press attention. The rooms were well appointed with mahogany tables and fitted in nickel, and they could accommodate several customers at a time. Visiting a salon for an upper class woman was a rather discreet affair. It was not a social outing like it was for men going to the barber shop, or as it would become in the early 20th century for women as well. The need for discretion was furthered by the fact that the majority of first-rank hairdressers like L'Enterique in Paris were male. And then soon after the profession of hairdressing comes into its own in Paris, the profession in the United States would catch up to it. And the first American Hairdressing Academy was founded in Chicago in 1890 by two Frenchmen. But I wanted to show this image because um, we can see three male hairdressers. They're fully suited and they're working on women's hair. So the clients are sitting in the chairs, and notice that the sink is in front of them. So you would tip your head forward to have your hair washed rather than tip back the way that we do now. And there are these kind of discrete dividing screens between the work areas to provide privacy. And the caption for this image says shampooing in the American and French styles. So what does that mean? Well, American shampooing used water and was considered very au courant. The fact that a salon could offer wet shampooing indicates that it had invested in the necessary plumbing and heating apparatus to which US clients had become accustomed in the newer architecture at home. So women coming from their mansions like Alva Vanderbilt or Caroline Astor here in like Midtown, and it's Midtown now, but it was considered Uptown at the time on, say, East 56th Street and Fifth Avenue. They would have had plumbing and warm water in their homes. But in France, the architecture was older, and shampooing would often be done without water. And that would be what we call dry shampooing today, applying or spraying powder to the hair to absorb the dirt and oil and then combing it out. But my favorite aspect of this image from Lenterique Salon in 1893 is that it includes a large hooded metal hairdryer on wheels. So isn't this great? So you can see this apparatus in the middle of the image, and you can see the wheels. And this was one of the earliest hair dryers, and it would be rolled from workstation to workstation to dry clients' hair. Next slide, please. Lenterique, this establishment was several floors, like the House of Worth. So you can see this symbiotic connection between all of the members of the fashion industry. The Lenterique, this particular room is the florist workroom, and there were real flowers, but also women were fashioning silk flowers for sale. And in the back on the shelves, you can make out the name Lenterique, and then you can see these shelves with bottles of perfume that were for sale. There's another really terrific image of the perfume laboratory on the lower floor. It's really in the basement, and it's all kind of working men who are stirring these big vats of perfume, like really barrels of perfume, and it almost looks like they're making beer, but they're making perfume, and then it would be bottled and sold on the selling floor. Next slide, please. I struck upon this topic of considering how closely the different professions were working when I was flipping through pages of the fashion periodicals in Watson Library at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is one of the great joys of my spare time. Now, this one from 1858 lists the name of the coiffure. It has the name of the woman who did the hairstyles, and that's Madame Camproget, who needs to be researched, so I'll be working on her soon. And in the next slide, we have a plate from 1878. It's a French fashion plate. The dress is by Lefebvre and the perfume is by Legrand. So the perfumers are credited on these fashion plates in these high-end French magazines. And this really spoke to me because perfume is ephemeral. You can't smell it off the page. I mean, at that time, the pages were not scented. There were no slip-ins with like sample pages that sometimes you can still get in printed magazines today. But perfume's ephemeral, and so this phenomenon of crediting the perfumers and the hairdressers, but specifically the perfumers, really spoke to me about how important the perfumers were in the world of fashion. The periodicals also describe perfumed silk sachets that women would have sewn into their garments. So this is also really fascinating to me. So these silk sachets would be, say, 2 inches by 2 inches silk sachets, and then you could pick your favorite scents, like violet or iris, and you would clip the leaves and put them into the silk sachet, and then sew it into or have it sewn into the lining of your gown so that your gown had a scent that you identified with. Next slide, please. This is just an incredible existing example. I'm so happy that this exists. So again, this is an FIDM's collection in Los Angeles, but this is a dress by Baron. This is an image from their storage, an evening gown from about 1897. And you can see with where the blue arrow is that is a silk sachet sewn into the interior of the dress. And I only wish that we knew who the wearer was. We don't yet. Um, but to get a sense of what her favorite scent was and what could have possibly been in there, but it could be lavender or rose. And it would be really interesting to have a scientist we were talking about scent earlier, but to have a scent scientist, or a smell scientist, as they call them, maybe take some traces and figure out what the scent was. So many upper class women would have a signature scent with which they became associated. So for example, from newspapers of the period, we know that Caroline Astor liked wild lavender and garden roses mixed, and Alice Claypool Gwynne Vanderbilt preferred verbena, and First Lady Frances Cleveland wore Parma violet. Now, you could also ask for your signature scent to be enclosed in the dress box. So if you're a wealthy woman who was traveling from the US to France and you did all your shopping in a number of weeks, some of the dresses wouldn't be quite ready, and they would be mailed to you after you got home. But you could ask for your signature scent to be enclosed in the box. So when you received your dress box in the mail, you would open the tissue paper, what have you, and your signature scent would emit from the gift box. So it's just such a nice couture touch, I think. So now that we have a sense of the fashion industry in Paris, let's talk about how French styles disseminated in the United States. The next slide. In the United States, department stores still today, Lord and Taylor, B. Altman, Bloomingdale's, these department stores sold American.
Did Liz disappear? She'll be right back. Oh, okay.
Hi, am I
There.
still here?
Yeah.
Hi. Okay,
No worries.
so yeah, American goods were sold, but also French fabrics, trimmings, and finished high-end garments. And many of them were imported from Paris. I love this image is from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, 1873, and it shows opening day at the new location of the department store, Lord and Taylor. They're all packed into this new elevator, which is a fairly large space, sort of fascinated by it, but everyone's turned out in their best for opening day of Lord and Taylor. The buyers from the department stores would go to Paris, they would see the latest designs, and they would place orders for the department stores. And many of the buyers for the department stores were women. So that was sort of the pinnacle of working women's management roles, was to be a buyer for a department store. So the relationship between French couture and American department stores was symbiotic, and it did not take long for knockoff goods to come into the marketplace. And that's a topic I cover in my chapter called The Underworld and Afterlife of French Couture in the United States. Next slide. So I just have to show this. This is one of my favorite finds. This is a game it's called The Game of Playing Department Store. It's from 1898, and it's in the collection of the New York Historical Society. And it's just terrific. And when you kind of, it's like, it just gives so many details that you wouldn't get anywhere else. And the color is so vibrant. But It is small, so I placed a blue arrow there so you can see where the garments were shown, and they were in this section called dry goods, and there was also children's clothes there. There's also really fun, you can see there's like a cat. There's just really fun details in this image. There's also a lost children's office, which is really great. So if it's a children's game, that must have been really fun. So just giving an image, really just to give a sense of how pervasive the idea, the concept, the aura of the department store was in the middle to late 19th century in the United States. Next slide. Another way that styles disseminated was through pattern books and periodicals. Here's a colored lithograph put out by Butterick. This was showing summer fashions for 1875, and it's for summer. It's for summer. I love how economically designed it is because it's designed to show as many styles as possible in one image for women, but also a range of ages, including young girls and young boys. So just another example of terrific marketing and advertising for fashion in this period. Many of these hand-colored plates were taken directly from French periodicals without permission. Copyright just didn't exist in this period the way that it does today. So you do tend to see some of the same images crop up in French periodicals and American periodicals, and that's a form of disseminating styles. Next slide. One of the most influential women's magazines was Godey's Ladies Book, which many of you may be familiar with. It began in 1830 with the title The Ladies Book, and it was published in Philadelphia. It relayed styles from both London and Paris, and it carried accounts of royal events and masked balls in Europe. And this is a trade card, which would be, it's a form of advertising, so kind of like a calling card, but they're beautifully designed, beautifully colored, and there's many examples in libraries in many cities in the United States, including especially Philadelphia. Next slide. And this is an advertisement for Frank Leslie's. Frank Leslie's magazine and also Peterson's magazines were more middle-class magazines that provided similar coverage to Godey's. Now, Frank Leslie's put out a number of these special editions, and so this one is a special Gazette of Fashions that that it's 1870. This is kind of early in the period that we're talking about, but it says that that they're the authority on styles, and these styles are coming from France and from London, and so you get a sense of how the United States is always emulating Europe when it's looking for its fashion leader in fashions. Next slide, please. And this is a trade card for Broadhead and Sons from the late 19th century for dress goods. And I love showing this because it gives us a sense of how women were conversing. They were sharing ideas, sharing techniques, and about clothing and about where to buy things. So women could get their ideas from the magazines and then buy materials to sew dresses themselves. They would be sewing at home, or they could bring fabric or fittings to their local dressmaker and have their local dressmaker make the desired style for them. This one's from Jamestown, New York. I just like to show trade cards from various places in the United States because they're everywhere, but they really give us a sense of women in interiors and how women were dressing, and also how just widespread the vocabulary of dress goods were. Next slide. This is an etiquette book called Decorum from 1878, and women would share social norms and convey them through etiquette books. This is a beautiful one from the Library Company of Philadelphia, and there are scores of these. You can find them online. Really, really fun to click around and look around the pages and see what was being recommended for how you should, how many petticoats you should be wearing, what colors you should be wearing in what season, what colors dress fabrics would go best with your hair color, things like that. Next slide. Okay, but we can't talk about fashion in the late 19th century without talking about the Great Vanderbilt Ball of March 26, 1883. This was a housewarming for William Kissam Vanderbilt and Alva Vanderbilt. It was held at 665th Avenue at 52nd Street in New York. And I'm showing right now the electric light dress worn by Alice Claypole Gwynn Vanderbilt, and the dress on the left and a photograph on the right, just to set the scene, and then I'll come back to them. The Vanderbilt family was descended from 17th century settlers, but they had made their money through new shipping and railroad enterprises. So they were considered nouveau riche, and they were consistently trying to counteract that perception. And some people were not very kind when they spoke about their Vanderbilt family. It's hard for us to envision today because Vanderbilt is associated with such wealth and respect. But at the time, by one account, the Vanderbilts were said to have, quote, were raised to social eminence by vulgarly gotten wealth. Okay, so Alva Vanderbilt, especially, who was this force of nature. Some of us have read about Alva Vanderbilt before, but she tried to counter that perception by building this magnificent mansion on East 52nd Street, and she wanted to rival her nemesis, Caroline Astor, who also had built a large mansion on Fifth Avenue. So Alva Vanderbilt held a fancy dress ball. It was on a Monday evening, and she welcomed hundreds of guests. She was rumored to have spent $250,000 in total on one party, and that's the equivalent of nearly $7 million today. It's really impossible to imagine the levels of wealth that were happening at this time. Now, always emulating European royalty, Alva wore to her ball, she was dressed as a Venetian princess, based on a painting by Alexander Cabanel. But here we're looking at the famous electric light dress worn by Alice Claypole Gwynn Vanderbilt. She was the sister-in-law of William Kissam Vanderbilt, who was the husband to Alva Vanderbilt, who was funding this mansion. And this electric light dress is custom made by Worth. It came with a prop. It came with a battery powered torch that you can see in the photograph. And the photograph is by Jose Mora, who took images at the party and also did studio photographs after the party, since so many people wanted them. I've seen this dress. It's part of the collection of the Museum of the City of New York. It's not on display now. It was on display a few years ago at the museum at FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. It was behind plexiglass to keep it safe, but I was able to get as close as possible to it, which was really thrilling. And the dress is much more vibrant in person than it is in this image. It's also fairly petite, so I'm 5'2", and I would say that the wearer of the dress was about 5'1". But it's really incredible. You can see the tinsel at the shoulders and at the bust line, which would have caught the electric light overhead and really sparkled. It's a really magnificent dress in person. So it was made, we know, by the House of Worth on a rush order for Mrs. Vanderbilt. And I like to point out here that this is a costume, right? This is for a fancy ball, which is essentially a costume ball, and the House of Worth made it. So there was no stigma in the fashion industry for these houses of couture to be making couture gowns for the opera or for dinner parties, but also to be making them for costume parties. And I think that is something that is very different today. Next slide, please.
I just wanted to point out this could just be a total coincidence, but
Yeah.
the timing coincides with the Statue of Liberty, and there's just something about her holding that, lamp
Yes.
up. I don't know if you've ever looked into that at all, if there's any, you
I
know,
think for sure. I think for sure. I think you're absolutely spot on with that, with holding the torch, holding the battery torch for sure. This is Cornelius Vanderbilt II at the left. So I want to show how men were also really turning out for these parties. And Alice is seated in this image, so you can see that there was also a fan that she was holding. So remarkably, I learned just a few weeks ago that the museum of this photograph is in New York Historical Society. You can see NYHS, but the electric light dresses in the Museum of the City of New York, they also have Cornelius's outfit. And I didn't know this until a few weeks ago. And you can see in his hand and his arm, he is holding a tricorn hat. And the museum, the city of New York, has the tricorn hat. So I've seen images. My friend was able to see it in storage recently. Just incredible. He's also wearing a powdered wig, trying that out for size, and also notice his stockinged legs. So at these fancy balls, there were a lot of men wearing stockings and buckled shoes from the previous period. Next slide, please. So where did people get their ideas for their outfits, for their costumes at these fancy balls? One place that they got them were from costume books. And one of them best known is this one by Arthur and Holt called Fancy Dresses Described. It was first published in 1879, and then it went into 5 more editions by 1896. And I say that because multiple editions means that people were constantly using and referring to it. The guide provides a glimpse into the zeitgeist of the mid to late 19th century, mid to late 1880s. And it gives you a sense of the themes that people were really paying attention to and that were on their minds. So that includes electric light, it includes newspapers, telegrams, photography, postage, to name just a few. There's also a drawing for dressing as a chocolatier. They get really, really interesting, but the Hornet was especially popular, and we can see here in the photograph by Maura, this photograph of Constance Reeves Borland at the Vanderbilt Ball, and she is dressed as a hornet. You can see that it's pretty clearly based on the image from Holt's book, but her dressmaker made a few changes. So in the image in Holt, it's almost like a turtleneck with like a form-fitting black long sleeve shirt. And then for Borland, her dressmaker has made it sleeveless. Also notice the gloves instead of the long sleeve shirt with the dark gloves. These gloves show her upper arm, which is a little risque, but you could get away with more at a fancy dress ball. And then do notice the wings in the back. So sometimes it's easy to overlook the wings in the Mora photo, but she does have the wings that are a little different, but you can see that it is based on Holt's suggestion. The next slide, please.
we just have a couple of questions coming in about the kind of different categories of dresses.
Oh,
Um, so Phyllis is wanting to know what makes the electric light dress a costume versus an opera dress. And then we have a question from Elaine about the difference between a dinner dress versus an opera dress.
sure. So do you want to go back to the electric light for one moment? So the electric light dress is very, when you see it in person, so it has the tinsel, and then it has these kind of like almost golden like bolts of light. Like when you see it in person, it comes across as very costumey. There's no question about it. It's like not a refined pattern that you would see in an evening dress or an opera dress. It's not like lined with like pearls or gems. It's very much like glitzy. It's much more showy. It has a much more elaborate bustle that would be let down and would go into a train. There's no question. And that it's a costume. And again, this is why the Mora photograph is so useful, is that it shows all the accessories that went with it. So she has the battery powered torch, and then in the other photo she has the fan, and then you can see these tassels. So it's the best thing I can say is that it's kind of like almost more of a costume that you would see worn by a performer on a stage than by a refined woman at a dinner party. And that allowed these balls to become a performance in and of themselves. So finally, in dressing up, I have a chapter about recycling and repurposing of clothes in the period, which speaks to the larger theme of how American women came to the couture marketplace with a deep knowledge of fabric, sewing, and caring for garments. So here we see a two-piece dress made by French couturier Melanie Pascoe. So this is a woman designer from about 1878. It was purchased by Frances Drexel Paul. This is the Drexel family of Pennsylvania. And in the portrait at the right, this is by Charles E. Drake. The portrait's from about 1890. This portrait is much later than when she purchased the dress that you can see on the left, from about 1878. So in the portrait, she wears an alternate bodice. It's a much more lower cut bodice. It's short sleeves. It would be worn in the evening. That speaks to the question about a dinner dress versus an evening or opera dress. In the evening at a dinner, in the evening at an opera or at a ball, it was acceptable to show more skin. It was just like just more a tiny bit informal in a way, even though they were wearing much more risque outfits than sitting at a formal dinner. So this is a way to show that these women would stretch their purchases, if you will. So some of these women were going to Paris twice a year and buying fabric and getting their couture dresses made. They would buy some extra fabric while they were there, and then they would have additional pieces made at home. So Frances Drexel Paul most likely had this alternative bodice made by a local dressmaker, and then she could switch it out and use this garment for multiple occasions. And what did women do when they were finished with their dresses? They might sell them to a secondhand purveyor, or they might donate them to middle-class women or to their ladies' maids. And this led to the trickle-down effect of disseminating styles over the course of several years. So these women were very much trendsetters, dictating styles as much as the couturiers were. Next slide. So I want to finish with Frances Folsom Cleveland, who some of you may know. She was Frances Folsom of Buffalo, New York, and she married sitting President Grover Cleveland on June 2nd, 1886, when she was 21 years old. He was much older. He was in his late 40s. For the wedding, she wore a gown believed to be by the House of Worth, and there's some photographs existing of that. But she became a style icon. So again, this sense of the women setting the trends and dictating the styles to the couturiers and the dressmakers. She became a style icon. She had women across the country copying her garments and her very signature hairstyle. She had these curly bangs that framed her forehead and her temples. Next slide. We get a further sense of Frances Cleveland's style when we look at this ensemble. This is a skirt and bodice scenario ensemble in the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Institution. And during my research, I learned that the original floral sheen skirt and peach velvet bodice was probably made around 1895 by the House of Doucet. So remember all the way back to the Barraud painting where we saw the sign for Doucet. But the green velvet bodice was created later. We can have the next slide to show that a little more closely. This bodice was created later by dressmaker Lottie M. Barton in Baltimore. And so this ensemble was a combination of work by a French couturier, and it was supplemented by this bodice commissioned by an American dressmaker, all of which underscores the main themes of dressing up. So there was a rootedness in familiar local practices, but it also produced kind of this entrenched frugality in a way that was not relinquished quickly, even by first ladies, by Mrs. Cleveland. It's known, I just have to mention this, that women like Mrs. Cleveland would bargain down prices by the French couturiers, and many of them would bring this extra French fabric home and have it made locally. So kind of always, wealthy women, but still very savvy about how they spent their money. Final slide, please. Just have my contact information if you have. I know we're going to do some questions, but if you want to stay in touch. But to wrap, I just want to say that these women that we are looking at, that we talked about today, they were exerting their influence on one of the key industries in France's economy, which was couture. And in the United States, they were influencing local dressmaking and department store businesses. They were impacting the economics of this era on their own terms, and they relied on their expertise, as well as their knowledge of their deep knowledge of fabrics. And they could make or break reputations. So they had a significant impact on a major industry, both as consumers and as influencers. Thank you very much for your attention. And I know we have some questions. Those were just for fun in case Gilded Age comes up in any of the questions.
Oh,
But
okay.
yeah, if you want to leave that image up, we could use that, or we could, however you'd like to do it. I don't know how many people are watching the Gilded Age show. They're filming the third season now. But this is just an image of an interior salon with some of the main characters, and it just gives you this sense in color, because so much of what we look at in the late 19th century is black and white, but just the extraordinary color of the dresses, and these are done with a little bit of artistic license, but the color of the fabric and the furniture and the carpeting, and we were talking about curtains, we were talking about paintings on the walls when we were talking about the Felix salon, and also the ferns, the greenery. So if you can imagine how vibrant the world of couture was in the late 19th century, I think this image brings us there just a little bit.
This was
Should I
fab.
go?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
I actually, since you're bringing up this issue of color, and we do have an idea of the colors that were used thanks to these periodicals and the fashion plates, which I love, and they're like wonderful to collect and frame and put on your walls from the Marché aux Puces and the different
Oh,
markets, flea markets in Paris. But do we have more advanced like knowledge of those colors? When you're looking at some of these dresses from the 19th century, are there conservators who are able to gauge, okay, this was amped up to this color, and really to give us a better sense of, because I really think of the decades in the 20th century in terms of color, at least in the late 20th century, like the 60s, we have colors in our mind from that period, and the same with the 70s, 80s, so forth. I'm just curious, color must have been an integral part in all of this.
it was. And when you read the women's diaries and letters, they're always talking about the colors and patterns of fabrics and what they've have their eye out for in the marketplaces in France, and always talking about color. And as far as restoring color of dresses today, the work of the costume and textile conservators is just, it's it's so admirable. We need we need them to keep going. We need funding for them. They're doing incredible work, but yes, they can take samples of a sample, like tiny sample, microscopic samples of the dyes that remain on the dresses and get a sense of how vibrant they would have been. So in the Sleeping Beauties exhibition at the Met, most recently, there was a House of Worth gown called the Cloud Gown, and it was laying flat because it was too fragile to be dressed on a mannequin. So it was laying flat. It's fairly faded, and so it just kind of in color comes across as like tan, basically. But then the conservators and the scientists were able to figure out that the original color was actually a light pink, more of like kind of a salmony pink, and they restored that to us by coming up with a virtual reality an augmented reality video that shows us in 3 dimensions what that gown, how it would have moved when a woman was wearing it, in how it would have moved in space 3 dimensionally, but also the color. And the color is more of a pink or a salmon. So we always have to use our imaginations that these dresses were so vibrant. And I love the point you make about the fashion plates, because many of the fashion plates are remarkably well, conserved, especially if they were in magazines and they were laying flat between other pages. Like when I open those, I'm always shocked by how well preserved those colors are. And it's so rare that you see an actual existing dress with that same color preserved. Now, this image from the Gilded Age, we know that the costumer, who's incredible, I have her name, Kasia Maynanis. She has to use some artistic license with the designs, and she has a really terrific Instagram account where she will post the some of the, like, her mood board and where she gets the ideas for the colors. They are a little bit exaggerated.
Yeah, I'm looking at this
Yeah.
vibrant lime green,
Yeah.
olive green, yeah.
So I was wondering, looking at this also, um, the costumes that are vibrant, is it more age related? Are the people younger with the more vibrant costumes, and then the ones on opposite sides are more stately with the color selection?
I think so. I think that age comes into play, and I think also the class comes into play. So we were talking earlier about Alva Vanderbilt being more nouveau riche and kind of being more showy. So the character at the left, Carrie Coon's character, is supposed to be based on Alva Vanderbilt. So those are some of the more flashy patterns and colors. And then the characters like Aunt Ada and Aunt Agnes. I think this is, and so I think, I don't know if that's Cynthia Nixon's character shown here. I can't quite tell. But in the show, the characters played by Cynthia Nixon and Christine Baranski are more of the, like, the Astor family, and more of the old money, and they tend to be more reserved in the colors that they wear. And that does jive with the research that I've done on Caroline Astor. So she, in the fashion pages of the newspapers, they mentioned that Caroline Astor preferred to wear black and dark purple. Those were like her colors. And so she was pretty well understated with her colors, but then she would wear really flashy diamond tiaras and stomachers. So she went more flashy with the jewelry. So
Thank you.
Two questions. How do you track the wearer of one of these dresses? And if you wore the wrong dress to the opera, was that considered a faux pas?
yes. So how do you track the wearers? This is so interesting, and I'm working on it now, but the provenance of these dresses, depending on what collection they're in. So many of these dresses will be in museum collections or historical societies. The historical society collections tend to know the wearers of the gowns more so than the museum collections, because historical societies are local usually, and the provenance will be known. So you'll get like, they will get like a whole trunk of dresses from that have descended from one family, and then through like family records or letters, they can donate the garments and family documentation showing who would have worn what at what time. So the wearers, for example, at the Cleveland Historical Society, the wearers of the women who wore the dresses in their collection are mostly known, and they're mostly from the Cleveland area. So that's like a gold mine. Other museum collections are more varied in who wore the dresses, and a lot of times we don't know. So there are several dresses in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the Costume Institute that are descended from the Astor family, and if we try to put two and two together, we can figure out that a couple of the dresses were worn by Caroline Astor, the mother, and a couple were worn by Carrie Astor, the daughter. And then if you wore the wrong dress to the opera, yes, you would be talked about. Usually, I mean, there's gossip columns in like the newspaper called Town Topics, and then regular newspapers, just city newspapers, would constantly track what women were wearing of, the finest families, and what they were wearing to parties and to operas. And if you were a newcomer to the city and you weren't quite wearing the right thing, yes, they would comment on it for sure.
Does that mean you couldn't wear the same thing twice?
It does not mean that. This is very, very interesting. Like a practice from this period was to rewear dresses, and people would absolutely rewear dresses. There's no question about it. Caroline Astor would wear some of her black or purple dresses multiple times. She might alternate between the year that she would wear them, but because these were such high quality garments, they were respected. And again, these women were spending so much money on them that they were respected as wearable works of art. So they would certainly rewear them. They would might have them refashioned a couple of years later to be more up to the moment. Another way that they would vary the look of the dress was to vary the jewelry that they were wearing with the dress, or to vary the hat that they were wearing with the dress.
So we had a question from Phyllis about the standards in the 1800s for being considered couture, like an official couture house, versus today. I know there are some like more official requirements to have that label. Do you know just like how different that was at the end of the 19th century versus now?
Yeah, it was, I think I have this in the book. It gets a little tricky, but there's like a professional organization that controls who could be called a couture house. And it's a political organization. And so, and it's men, of course, who are on the boards of these organizations. So there's, you can track it, but their rules and regulations just are constantly changing. But they did try to regulate it. It was very much a gatekeeping organization.
It sounds very French.
Oh, it was very French. Yes.
Oh, so Ruth was saying that Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris is another film that shows the couture houses. Is this the one that you recommend for authentic?
I love that one.
Yeah.
I think that's later, right? Is that from showing the 1950s?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think it is later. It's more 1950s. It was more that it's not historically the same period. It's just nice seeing what the Paris couture houses might have looked like, really.
I love that. Yeah, I absolutely. And she gets fitted kind of with like the muslin, and there's that kind of exuberance of being from a different class who, may not have ever, a woman who may not have ever dreamed of wearing a dress of that caliber, but yes. And then like the models and the kind of a little bit over exaggerated with the what the director of the house, how would have treated the clients and who you were and whether you had a name that meant something to them. But that's a really fun
Yeah,
movie for
yeah.
yeah, I recommend that one. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had another question as well, if you don't mind, as I've unmuted. I think it was the hornet dress that you showed. The dress didn't go to the ground, so you could see her shoes, whereas the other dresses at that period seemed to go to the ground. Was it seen as sort of risque that you're showing your feet and showing your shoes?
Definitely showing your ankles for sure was risque. And that's what's so fascinating about these fancy balls is that it was an event that you could be transgressive, right? So you could take this moment to show, glimpses of your body that otherwise wouldn't be acceptable because it's a performance and you're putting yourself out there, but just for a few hours. But that's a great observation that absolutely showing the ankles and showing more of the shoe than just the like toe and the heel. Yes, for sure. Thank you for pointing it out.
And I guess an excuse when it's a costume, you can kind of get away with more things.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have a
Agree.
question so Estelle is asking if costume designers for film and theater consult with experts like yourself, the ones that care about authenticity, because we see so many,
Yeah.
series out there that are clearly not true to any historical period, but
They do. I haven't consulted on the Gilded Age, but I've had some queries, come in. They do consult. In my kind of circle of people, everyone wishes that they would consult a little bit more, but there's probably a reason why they don't. I mean, some of the dress designs, you need when you're doing a television show, you need color and zip and I mean when you have Meryl Streep's daughter as one of the actresses, I mean this Louisa Jacobson, she's in like lemon yellow almost every single scene, in a way that I don't think would be especially accurate. But they do consult. They do have some people there. And Bridgerton, yeah, Bridgerton is like, that took me a while to get used to because it's so over the top.
I have a hard time watching it.
I couldn't watch it at the beginning, and I couldn't, one of the most jarring things for me was the music, like contemporary music with a historical period. That was so jarring. And then the outfits, but I've come around because the hairstyles are so over the top that they are intriguing to me as a symbol of excessiveness. But yeah, I much prefer the Gilded Age over Bridgerton, I have to say.
I'm really curious about women of color and couture. I mean, this was like something even, I mean, it was such a statement to wear these dresses that it was like a whole family's salary for years. Were there some, really powerful individuals, women of color who were able to wear couture really early on?
I think there's a lot more work to be done in this area. I think that if we start, some of us who are working on this, if we start doing more research in, say, the Brooklyn, New York newspapers, we'll be finding a lot more information. The one figure who we know was very much wearing high-end fashion. I don't think it was Parisian tour, I think it was US made, with Ida B. Wells, who was an activist and a writer, a newspaper journalist. She was also a co-owner of one or two newspapers, and very much like spoke out against lynching. She wrote many tracts on anti-lynching. She was known for, and there's evidence of it in her writings, of buying high-end garments. She was very much into how she presented herself, and she liked clothes and she liked hats. And also in Beyond Vanity, you'll see that she focused on her hair. She wore kind of like a Gibson girl kind of bouffant at a certain point, and she kind of becomes known for wearing a certain updo, naturally styled updo. But other figures, there's more work to be done. As far as I know, there's only one book, and I'm not crazy about the book, so and I don't have the title on me at the moment, but it's there's more work to be done. There's more research to be done.
And do you think, I mean, you had mentioned that historical societies generally have more information rather than, museum archives. I've always been disappointed going into museum archives. I'm like, you should have more information on this painting, and you just have auction record clippings. Like, how is that helpful for me?
Fine.
Where's the place to go to start this kind of research that clearly needs to be done?
Yeah, I mean, I can't wait to get into, there's a historical society in Connecticut, the New Canaan Historical Society in Connecticut has, it was a wealthy area, and many of the garments that they have in the collection, the wearers are known. Many of them haven't been fully fully cataloged yet, so there's so much work to be done, but they have incredible, incredible dresses that are just being like restored and gathered and put out there today. So that's one. And then I'll mention again the Cleveland Historical Society. They have this name. It's like the Cleveland Reserve or Historical Society. It has the word reserve in it. They have a wonderful collection and a wonderful curator. But again, many of these historical societies are underfunded, they're understaffed. Both of the ones that I just mentioned have one person working in the costume. The Museum of the City of New York has one person working
Wow.
on fashion. I mean, she can't get to everything. I just had drinks with her the other night. There's so much more to discover. It's super exciting, I think. I mean, but if you want to get started, I would go to your local historical society and say, what do you have for garments? What do you have for fashion? They'll probably have mostly middle class and upper class, depending on the area.
That's fascinating. I wonder why fashion has been so overlooked when it gives us so much insight into everyday life, and it's this very interesting and important way of understanding behaviors and also gender relations and all sorts of things. It's interesting that it really has been overlooked as a field, I think.
For sure. And these are themes that are running through dressing up, and what I hope the book will contribute to the field, especially for this period. We have many more fashion books on 20th century fashion, late 20th century, especially, but they're often more of like picture books in a way, and not, heavily researched. I think probably the reason is that it's a women's area of focus, and that women shopping has been, kind of a subject that can be seen as frivolous, but when you really spend time looking at it, you can see all of the decision making that went into picking the fabrics, picking who you wanted your designer to be, deciding how much money you're willing to spend, and bargaining. I mean, the power of that alone. So just the more we get this work out there, I think the more we can change how fashion history is regarded.
Absolutely. And it was a way for women to wield power in the world where they were limited in pretty much every other arena. And also, if we look at literature, it really highlights literature of this period, both French and American literature highlights fashion. I mean, I'm thinking of like Edith Wharton, and I'm thinking of Emile Zola, who wrote about the first department store in Paris that's still around, in Au Bonheur des Dames, which is the Bon Marché today. And so, I mean, the fact that authors, are highlighting fashion, and because it gives us insight into women's lives and how, and you kept mentioning that they didn't need to be chaperoned. So that was significant because women in the 19th century could not wander the city streets alone, and fashion and these new these couture houses, but then more, I guess, broadening things was the department store, because women of various, the upper, well, the middle classes and the upper class could go to a space where they were safe without the need of having someone follow them around all the time. So yeah, I think there's so much to be learned here. Ruth is mentioning also the Victoria and Albert Museum. Is that one of your favorites?
It's my favorite. I've been a couple of times in the last couple of years. I just wish they would put more out. They have this sort of this like circular gallery space, and they go kind of period by period, which is useful to go chronologically. But it's behind plexi, and it's like, yeah, I just want to get closer to these garments. But yeah, the V&A is such a resource, and yeah, I just wish they would rotate the permanent collection a little bit more. They're doing kind of these flashy exhibitions now where they're doing like Naomi Campbell's, a focus on Naomi Campbell's style, or like, fashion models and what they wore. So that's all great. But it does take up space that maybe we could see more permanent collection in someday. But
And
Yeah,
yeah,
I completely agree. I love Victoria and Albert, but they have massive collections that aren't on show. And yeah, you're right. The permanent collection of fashion is so old-fashioned, isn't it? Even though
yeah.
their big shows like Dior and Chanel are really great. But yeah,
Yeah, that's where the money goes, to the big
yeah,
flash.
and it's obviously a money maker, isn't it? Mm.
Exactly. I agree with that.
the library at the Victoria and Albert Museum, I spent many hours there. They have a lot of periodicals, and it was useful for my art historical research, but I can just imagine for fashion history, there must be a lot of gems in that library.
And that library is an incredible collection, and they have the archives for the House of Worth designs, which I haven't gotten into yet. Other people have done wonderful work on that, but thank goodness that those business records were kept and those designs were kept for the House of Worth, because it's a touch point for all these other designers for whom we don't have those records. But yeah, the V&A, yes,
Yeah.
a major resource.
Have either of you been to the British Library in London?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really great self research, but I don't need to tell you that, that already.
No,
Oh, yeah.
that's an incredible library. They have absolutely everything,
They have
everything.
everything.
And it's interesting too to be doing this research on French fashion. You really do have to take this as becomes international. I mean, because the dresses were disseminated to the US, and I'm imagining also the England was following French fashion at the same time as well. I mean, the French fashion houses were leading the way. And so in order to carry that research out, you have to go to these other places. And I'm thinking about the French museums, and they don't tend to show as impressive a display of dresses as do, other museums outside of France. So it's interesting just like where these dresses have ended up in the world, and what happened to all the dresses in France. I mean, I'm just curious about, the wealthy women there in Paris actually living there, and the dresses must have been different in a way, for compared to the dresses that the American women are purchasing
Mhm.
and bringing home.
Yeah, I agree. There is the Musée des Arts Décoratifs has a show right now on shopping in France, and it does, I think the earliest it is around 1850, but it kind of, and then it goes into early 20th century, but there are some garments there in that show, and there are a number of posters and for like Bon Marché, as you mentioned, the department store. So posters and sort of ephemera. There's some shoes, there's some parasols, some handbags. That's a great show. So those and those are they're showing French clients and also clients from the US and from other areas in Europe. But you're right, you're right, you're right. We need more, we just need more exhibitions and permanent collection from this period. The 20th century and 21st century gets much more attention.
And what about these exhibitions that bring art and fashion together? And there have been some really fabulous exhibitions that have incorporated fashion, of the 19th century alongside the paintings where
Yeah,
some of these dresses might appear. And that's always a nice way to kind
I
of
love that.
revitalize
I
things.
love that. There's, I mean, I'll always be interested in like a side by side of a dress and a painting that shows the dress. I mean, that's sort of the ideal. It rarely, we have so few examples of that, but I'm all in favor. I mean, I think everything was interdisciplinary, everything was multimedia in the period. So why not see them all in one space? And I'm also like a real fan of period rooms, which I know are like out of fashion, or maybe they're coming back in fashion. I don't know. But we have period rooms at the Met, and I get completely lost just in them, just standing there and envisioning, this, having the space around you, I feel is, um, it's irreplaceable.
I've always loved period rooms and
Yeah.
historical
Yeah.
homes where you can see
Yeah.
that.
Show me a dusty period room with like lampshades. I'm all over it.
And I'm wondering, it would be so great to see Madame Gautreau's dress next to the Madame X painting. Do we know what happened to that dress? Was it just like put in was it burned? Like,
I
because
don't think we'll
that
ever
ruined her career, and her.
Yeah, I don't think anyone will ever figure it out. People are really obsessed with that painting, and I use it as a touch point, but I also move on to other paintings.
Yeah.
But a lot of people just are really, really intensely fascinated by it. So I don't, I can speculate, but there's the dress we're seeing it flat, and it's unusual for Sargent to show a dress like flat, like a solid color dress, and to see it so like straight on like that. But I imagine if he had shown her in 3/4 view and turned just any which way, we would see the bustle and the whole image and our whole perception of the modernity or the risque aspect of that dress would completely change. I mean, if we saw the like curve of this is the period when you would have a bustle. So why did he choose to show it flat? I don't know.
Wow. I think he was remarkable in the way in which he painted dresses. So that in and of itself is worth the study, but that's a really key point. I mean, that painting, we can essentially wear that dress today. I didn't know that it was a jeweled,
Yeah.
I thought it was
Mhm.
just a gold chain, but okay, so there were actual
Mhm.
jewels on
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
straps.
Right. But there's no other adornment that we see on the painting. I think that's why we're so drawn to it. We can all envision wearing like a slim fitting dress. Then there was Nicole Kidman who was photographed like, and so it's a dress that keeps us thinking, and in some ways I wish we could do the augmented reality for that how like maybe envision how that dress would look in 3 dimensions. I think it would change our perception completely.
or augmented reality to see what we would look like in any of these dresses. Like,
I know.
how cool would that be?
So cool. I just got I'll make this very short little tangent, but I just got an email yesterday from a woman who was really interested in fashion this period, and she came to one of my talks and she wrote and she said, Liz, I finally got chosen as an extra for the Gilded Age set. So she's going to be filming, and she had a fitting of a dress. So this would be like 1885, and she said it had 7 layers of undergarments. She's wearing a corset and then the bustle behind. And she said, just the fitting alone, like it was so heavy. And that was just the fitting. And then she was going to do the shoot. So I'll find out from her, because I asked her, I said, please tell me how it feels to move around in that many layers with the heavy fabric. Um, so yeah, maybe she can take a video, but yeah, the augmented reality of that would be really helpful.
Yeah, minus we wouldn't get the actual feel of the weight
The
of these
weight, I think,
dresses.
especially in winter with those velvets.
Yeah. So before we go today, tell us about your next book. So I put in the links for both of your books.
Oh,
So
thank
the one
you.
we learned about today was Dressing Up. The next one,
Yep.
Beyond Vanity, is coming out September 10th. And we're coming together again at 5 p.m. on September 11th to celebrate the release of this book. So what is it all
Thank
about?
you.
Yeah.
So Beyond Vanity it's called Beyond Vanity, the History and Power of Hairdressing. So that was one of my advanced author copies I just showed you. It's coming out September 10, and it's the same period that we've been talking about. So approximately 1865 to 1900, and looking at the world of hair and how powerful hairstyles were to individual presentation for white women of all classes, for Black women, mixed race women. That's a big difference from the previous book, but looking how women cared for their hair, how doing their hair was a part of showing respectability. I get into respectability politics there, but also really, really fun like details about what the shampoos were like. They used all these homemade shampoos with egg yolks, which were meant to add moisture to the hair. And so hair practices, and also the power of hairstyles in society. So please do join us. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
That's fascinating. I can't wait to read your book, which I'm going to order today. And
Thank you.
thank you so much for this, fun exploration
So
into the
fun.
world of fashion. This has been absolutely fascinating. And I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you all come and join us again for our celebration for this new book. And what a fascinating topic, and definitely something that merits a lot more study. So it's great that you're out there and doing it.
Thank you. Thank you for all your excellent questions. You've really made me think about more that I want to do. And please do join us again. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. It was great.
You're
Have
most
a great day,
welcome.
everyone.
Bye.
You too.
Bye.
Bye. Take good
Bye.
care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.